The Supreme Court has sided with ExxonMobil in a major ruling over assets seized by Cuba more than 60 years ago, and it could reshape how American companies pursue compensation for property taken by foreign governments. Here's the backstory. Back in 1960, a company then called Standard Oil, which later became Exxon, had a substantial operation in Cuba. More than 100 service stations, refineries, fuel distribution across the island. Then Fidel Castro came to power, nationalized private property, and just like that, those assets were gone. Exxon valued that loss at more than $70 million, back in 1969. Exxon eventually sued 3 Cuban government-owned companies, arguing those entities had been profiting off its stolen refineries and stations ever since, without ever paying a dime in compensation. The legal obstacle? A law called the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, which generally shields foreign governments and their state-owned companies from being sued in U.S. courts. The lower court sided with the Cuban entities, saying Exxon couldn't get past that immunity shield. The Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision along ideological lines, disagreed. The conservative majority pointed to a separate law, the Helms-Burton Act, passed in 1996, which allows Americans to sue over the trafficking of assets seized by Cuba, but only at the president's discretion. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, writing for the majority, said the president, not the courts, is the gatekeeper for these lawsuits. Since the Trump administration has actively backed Exxon's case and views these suits as a foreign policy tool to pressure Havana, the majority said blocking them would undercut the president's authority. The 3 liberal justices weren't convinced. Justice Elena Kagan argued the Helms-Burton Act simply doesn't address, not one word, she said, the question of stripping Cuba of its traditional sovereign immunity. That protection, she wrote, remains intact. The ruling doesn't hand Exxon a win outright. It sends the case back to lower courts for more proceedings. But it clears a major legal hurdle that had blocked the lawsuit from moving forward. The broader context here matters. This is the second big Cuba property ruling from the court this term. In May, the justices sided with a U.S. port business that sued cruise lines for using confiscated docks in Havana. And it comes as President Trump is actively squeezing Cuba economically, including blocking oil shipments from Venezuela and Mexico. The administration explicitly told the court these lawsuits are a diplomatic lever to discourage foreign investment in Cuba. Not everyone is comfortable with where this leads. International law scholars warned the court that a broad ruling could expose state-owned companies from Brazil, China, Russia, and Singapore to liability in U.S. courts simply for doing business with Cuba, a potentially destabilizing outcome for global trade relations. Exxon called Tuesday's decision a critical moment in what it described as a 60-year effort to be made whole for what Cuba illegally took. This is one of those cases where Cold War-era grievances and 21st-century geopolitics collide, and the Supreme Court just handed the executive branch a powerful new tool to fight that battle in the courts.